So you found yourself binging some classic cowboy movies and you're picturing what it would be like to live out the gunslinging, Indian fighting, whiskey drinking cowboy life that you've seen in the movies. But what if I were to tell you that the life of a cowboy was vastly different from what you've seen in those movies? An actual cowboy was so poor that he couldn't even afford a gun. And if he did have a gun, well, he didn't keep it by his side because those things were pretty heavy and you only really needed it for putting wounded animals out of their misery. And trust me, you really didn't want to be fighting Indians a lot because cowboys were pretty much always exhausted from no sleep and a terrible diet. What you really want is the life of a cowboy that was one of the innovators. Because although the era of the cowboy was not necessarily exciting the way it's portrayed on TV, it was incredibly exciting for the world of American entrepreneurship, innovation, and advancement. Before you had the tech billionaires of the Silicon era, and before you had the industrial mega millionaires of the manufacturing era, you had the ingenious minds of the cattle era. The ones who largely influenced the fervor of ambition and development seen in the country for years to come. So let's travel back to the Civil War. Texans have been forced to leave their ranches of cattle, and they haven't put much thought into what might happen to them. They were busy caring about losing their own life, so cattle's lives were not of the highest importance. A few years later, they return from the war, and they find that their cattle population has exploded. An army of millions of Texas Longhorns were now roaming the plains of Texas. And now the entrepreneur in you might be thinking, wow, so they now had these millions of cows to sell directly to the beef market immediately, right? Well, it wasn't that simple.
Beef wasn't nearly as popular as it is today, and most people were simply uninterested in eating beef.
Steaks cooked medium rare.
Can I get my steak cooked just
That wasn't no question.
Texans ate it, but it was cheap because there were so many cattle in Texas already. So there wasn't really that much money to be made at first. Let's head back up to the north for a second. You see, up here, the entire economy has been shifted to industrial work instead of agriculture. Companies were rapidly expanding thanks to wartime spending, and standards of living were rising along with them. Suddenly, there's this shift in taste, especially in the foods they eat, which happens a lot of times when the standard of living increases. People start to go, oh, pork, no, I don't eat that anymore. Do you have any beef? It's the hottest thing right now. All of a sudden, a cow worth $3 to $4 in Texas could sell in New York for $40 to $50. And now you've got that blinking green light of profit going off to the ranchers of Texas. They're going, I gotta get my cows up north. And so began the largest migration of animals in human history. Ranchers began to move their cattle all the way up to Kansas and Missouri to cities with established railroad stations. And from there, they could be shipped east, and ranchers could make more money than they'd ever seen in their entire life. But this process of getting their cows north turned out to be incredibly difficult. For months at a time, a team of cowboys and their superiors had to direct cattle through terrible terrain with no sleep, a horrific diet, the dangers of Indians, and the risk of stampedes. They were willing to risk all of that, though, for the mouth-watering profit of $50 per cow. But when word got out that these cows were going for that price, well, you had a new component enter the equation: bandits.
Bands of criminals would ambush cattle herds, purposely causing stampedes to break up the herd and steal cattle from the owners.
If things continued the way that they were, you'd soon have bandits stealing such a huge profit from the ranchers, the cattlemen, that it would no longer be worth it to make that long journey north. Which introduces us to our first cowboy era innovator, Joseph McCoy. He dreamed up the idea of a formal railroad depot specifically for the sale of cattle in Abilene, Kansas, a straight shot from the Texas ranches. You see, before you'd have to go to those established railroad towns like Sedalia, Missouri, and in all those moments across the wilderness, you'd expose yourself to the infamous bandits ready to steal your livestock. Plus, once you got there, you weren't always welcome. There was nowhere to house your cows, there was no easy way to load your cows onto the train, and the angry local ranchers would grumble that you were likely bringing new diseases to their own cattle and livestock. McCoy's idea would create a town specifically designed for loading and housing those cattle, and it would also allow cowboys to stay on the same well-traveled road with less likelihood of being ambushed. Now, this idea seems like an obvious one that any railroad would be glad to help bring to life, but the process of starting his business was actually much more challenging than you would think. McCoy visited several railroad companies and pitched them his idea, but got brutally denied time and time again. But he didn't give up. He reached out to Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, which embraced the idea and gave him the green light to begin construction. So he pooled some money from his family and he bought 250 acres in the northeast end of Abilene. And within 2 months, he had a cattle yard that could hold up to 3,000 head. He built an office, he built a barn, and he built the soon-to-be famous 3-story hotel named Drover's Cottage. He even bought a pair of 10-ton scales that could weigh 20 cows at a time. This place was going to be a rancher's dream. Once it was ready for production, McCoy took another huge gamble. He printed tons of handbills to be distributed across towns through Texas and the Southwest, and it announced the opening of the very first cattle town. He hired representatives on horseback to ride out into various directions and alert any Texas cattlemen already on the trail that a new depot had been built. This madman even arranged cattle buyers in Chicago, promising them that shipments would soon be headed their way. Days went by with no response. McCoy waited in distress for a herd to arrive over that horizon, when finally the distant sound of hooves stomping on the ground faded in and several thousand cattle rode in to become the first cow residents of Abilene, Kansas. Over that initial summer and fall of 1867, some 35,000 cattle arrived in Abilene, and a colossal 20,000 of them were shipped out by that railroad. All of a sudden, those same railroad companies that wanted nothing to do with McCoy came crawling back, offering to build a 100-car sliding area where cattle could be loaded into the stock cars. Soon after, McCoy's cattle pens could load 20 railroad cars in an hour, the fastest station in the nation. And just like that, McCoy had created the first cattle town. Over the next few years, McCoy would ship millions of cattle to the Northeast.
Now, not only did this end up being incredibly profitable, but it also earned him a spot in history, since these cow towns are how cowboys became known the way they are today.
It's where cowboys and civilization rubbed shoulders. It's where saloons opened up their bat-wing doors and welcomed in cowboys after their long journey north. It created a culture that people in the established East couldn't get enough of. So much so that many writers like Mark Twain and Stephen Crane visited Abilene simply to inspire their very own novels and short stories. As the acclaimed novelist Paul Wellman stated, it was one of the great single ideas of this nation's history. Now before I go, since this is a channel about entrepreneurship, I want to take a moment to highlight why McCoy was so successful and how you can implement it in your own pursuit of success. McCoy provided value, a solution to a problem that people were willing to pay for. Remember, at the end of the day, all money is perceived value. If the market perceives what you are offering as valuable, they'll pay for it, which is the exact fact that you need to be reminding yourself when you are pursuing something. You need to quickly bring it to market, fail, until you pivot to an idea that has perceived value from the market mind. That may seem like a simple idea, but you'd be surprised how many companies fail because they haven't addressed that exact idea. That's all I've got for you today. There's a few more interesting businesses that sprang up from the cowboy era, like the development of refrigeration in the railroad cars for transporting the meat easier. So if you'd like to see some of those business ideas, you can show me by liking, commenting, or sending this video to a friend. That way I know that this is a topic that you guys are interested in, and I'll spend some time on a video like that. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.